can't do that without a draft. It really all boils down to money. They don't want to have to pay for an army. And in March, I went and debated the former president of the Reserve Officers Association at a military base outside of Detroit. It was closed to both the press and the public, which is not surprising. I was surprised that he ever did it. The Selective Service used to debate resistors, and now they won't have any part of us, mainly because of the outcome of their first debates. I'm really surprised that anyone would debate, because they've been able pretty much to close down debate on the issue, and that's been their goal. That's why they prosecuted only those people who have been vocal, because they really need to stop discussion of the issue. Otherwise, Americans are likely to find out some of the things that Jeff told you, that the draft has never been successful, that the only time the draft is going to be successful or necessary is when we're fighting a war that the American people don't support. And yes, when the American people oppose a war, for the government to be able to continue to fight it, it's going to be necessary for them to force us at gunpoint to do so. And that's one reason to oppose the draft. The three things that I think are important for us to look into, and I'll welcome further questions on them because I don't think I have a whole lot of time to expound on them here. One, my main goal in continuing to fight the draft, national service, the registration program, and selective service as a whole, my main goal, and this is the group that I'm the president of, Volunteers for America, this is our focus, is to change the image of the draft opponent. I think that the majority of Americans, if we polled them, would come out in favor of the draft, and that's scary. But I think that that support is very, very weak, and that support for the draft is predicated on the opposition to the draft being pacifist, socialist, being seen as anti-American. And if the only opposition to the draft is anti-American, socialist, we want to take more from you, we want higher taxes, we want a more controlled society, but we're against the draft because it might be used to fight against a socialist or communist government. If that's the only opposition, or on the other hand, if the opposition is only we're against the draft because we're against anyone ever picking up a rifle and defending their home or what have you, that is not going to be accepted by the American people. If the choice is between having no military, having no defense, and having a draft, then the American people will choose the draft. But I'm convinced that if we can give them a better choice than that, we can begin to pull people away from support for the draft. If we can say, sure, we want to defend this country, we would support any type of voluntary means for defending it, and there's a lot of voluntary means. The Cato Institute, where I work as the director of SAIL, has a study out now saying that we could move to a voluntary program. It would be cheaper, and we'd have more motivated people who would actually make a commitment to serve in case of mobilization. Granted, all this preparedness, we have to remember that they're trying to prepare to defend the whole globe. So libertarians, I don't see that we need the type of preparedness they're talking about. But we can separate the issue and say, look, if we do need preparedness, why not voluntary military training? Have the government train anybody who's willing to be trained voluntarily. And that's the whole goal of Volunteers for America, to change the debate from militarism and pacifism, in which case I think people may actually choose militarism, change the choices to voluntarism or conscription. And if we can change that, I think the American people will choose voluntarism. So our main goal is go out there, change the image. Don't use a whole lot of libertarian macho flash or in the anti-draft movement this super anarchist communist type. We don't want any defense of our country. We're completely pacifist. Get away from that and start arguing how do we best defend our country. And the best way to do it is volunteers, and hence the name Volunteers for America. I think that is the most crucial thing, changing the image. Secondly, I think that there's a lot of Vietnam revisionism going on. And I think it's important for libertarians to be in the forefront of reminding the American people of what really happened in Vietnam. We didn't go over there with American support, with everybody understanding what we were doing, with a clearly defined purpose, and then all of a sudden the media and a bunch of commies turned against us. The government got involved in a war that the American people never supported, that Congress never supported, that had nothing to do with the defense of this country. To fight the war, they were forced to enslave a large segment of young people. They clamped down on free speech. They violated countless people's rights. We have 58,000 dead. We have millions of Vietnamese dead from it. We have children being born today deformed because of the pesticides, the Agent Orange that was sprayed over there. We have 500,000 to 1 million people who need daily help in coping with the experiences of that war. We have a list of victims that I can't go through. There are so many victims from that war. And I think it's essential that we don't allow people like Ronald Reagan with their slick image and their 30-second blurbs on the television news to redefine what Vietnam was all about. It wasn't a noble cause that the American people failed to protect and defend. It was a bad cause, and it was good that the American people had enough courage to take risks. And they took risks whether they supported the war or didn't. A lot of young people did. So I think it's a good thing. And I think Vietnam points to the fact that young people are willing to take a lot of risk, and they're not unpatriotic and cowardly as they're often pointed out as being, especially in some of the national service stuff. There's some stuff on the table back there after we're through that you might want to take a look at too, some articles. And I think if you'll read through some of the arguments for national service, such as that young Americans are spoiled, and other very strong philosophical arguments, you'll see that it's really a smokescreen. There's no need. They haven't pointed out the programs that are needed, that we need conscription for to fulfill. It's all this, let's have an ethic of service. And that's, I think, the exact opposite of what the libertarian movement is all about. We're about let's have an ethic of freedom. And I think that that's the reason that it's really going to take a libertarian opposition to stop the move toward national service and toward a military draft. My time is about up. The other thing I'd like to talk about, and this is something I think Jeff is very familiar with too, is attacking selective service. With all the talk about national service and the draft, a lot of times the only activity that comes up is every so often somebody introduces a bill or writes an op-ed piece and we all go, oh no, the draft is coming back. I think we need to fight that, but I think we also need to look at ways in which we can attack the root selective service, that we can attack draft registration, which is the program that's going on right now. And I think maybe in questions we can get to that a little more, but I think a starting place is hopefully maybe we can get some publicity and fight selective service on what they've done to Jeff. And maybe that's a start. Any other ideas would be welcome in the question and answer period. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. We have time for just a few questions now, and if you would, please try to state your question clearly and loudly, and identify, please, who it is that you would like to answer that question, and I will wrestle with a microphone here and hope that we can get it to that individual. Yes.
Not really. We haven't gotten that far, I don't think. I think that would take a little bit more organization than we are, and it's not that high on our priority list. But in the past, I've written things about, one of the first persons who came out and did selective service advertising was Wolfman Jack. And people like that whose whole livelihood is built on reaching out to young people, they could pay a pretty high price were we capable of making them pay that price. And, I'd advocated protesting outside of any movies he was involved in or shows or what have you, and didn't go to a couple movies I wanted to go to because he advertised for them. But I think that that's something that we do need to do. And there are other people who who have written letters. I've seen Walter Payton came out in favor of registration, and Gerald Walsh, who's a real go-getter in Illinois, wrote him a letter saying, how would you feel if the NFL draft were compulsory? I think that's something that we do need to do, and I think that goes back to attacking selective service. We're not going to be very successful if they're able to go on television, on radio, in the high schools with all their propaganda, and we don't answer it. Likewise, I don't think we're going to be very successful if they're able to pick and choose who's on the draft board. I'd like to stop it before it ever gets to that stage, but I think that's something that would cause a lot of alarm from people who maybe don't even disagree with the draft, but who'd like to see there be a, quote, fair draft, if that's somehow possible, for them to realize that the Selective Service pretty much handpicks this supposedly impartial draft board, and that people like Jeff, who disapprove of the draft, are booted off the draft board. So I think that the answer is for people to get active, and when Selective Service does some of these things, for us to fight them. I was very happy to be able to force Thomas Turnage to testify at my trial, because they are really actively avoiding any publicity other than little puff pieces in the newspaper when somebody from the Selective Service goes and travels about how nice their lists are and how clean the computer is. They really are avoiding any type of controversy. So I think the answer is to attack them on this, and I think one of the places where they might be vulnerable is some of the people who do their advertising. So I do see that as important. I haven't really had the wherewithal to hit that yet, but I think it is something we should hit.
Yes, ma'am.
Have representatives who are advocating non-intervention foreign policy along with volunteers for America? The draft would not be necessary when it was strictly protecting our freedoms.
Well, as far as Cato's been very big on advocating withdrawal from NATO, withdrawal from CETO, and which is the Southeast Asia, and getting out of Korea and Japan. So they've been active on that. And also has been active on non-intervention, on not getting involved with dictatorships, not getting involved even in revolutionary movements against Soviet power, that type of thing. So the Cato Institute is very clearly non-interventionist. As far as Volunteers for America, we don't really take a position officially as to what foreign policy we should have. Because I think even if you believed in a global military, the moral wrongness of the draft should preclude you from wanting such a program. But we definitely, since it is a private organization, we are able, and it's controlled by a board of directors who are all very opposed to intervention. We hope to educate people about the connection between the draft and foreign intervention, and the fact that the draft wouldn't be at all necessary. But the other point there is that even with intervention, the draft is only really necessary in a very limited amount of cases. If we were to be attacked in Western Europe, if Western Europe were to be attacked today, their draftees would never come into play. We would either be able to send reinforcements and stop the Soviets, and this is the military scenario, either be able to send reinforcements within 6 weeks, and obviously some right away, to stop the Soviets from pushing our troops into the sea, or we wouldn't, or it would escalate to nuclear conflict. But there's no way that we would be able to induct and train draftees. They would have no part to play in a war in Europe, which is what they're usually called for. The only scenario in which draftees would become necessary, and Jeff talked about it, so did I, is when we're fighting a protracted war that the American people don't support. And when I say don't support, that doesn't mean there aren't going to be a few people who support it, but the consensus does not support the conflict. And I think that's the scary thing about people talking about bringing back the draft. These politicians are not stupid. They know what the military scenarios are. And I think that the reason that they're bringing it back is because they'd like a freer hand in intervening abroad.
Okay. One last question. Yes, in the back. Joe.
I want to know if your trial, did you have a social security number and your organization, did they ever attack the United Nations treaty organization?
Our organization, again, doesn't really our goal is not to take really a position on the UN or other things. I support the UN closing down, or at very least forming somewhere other than U.S. soil. But we really don't take a position on the UN. As far as my Social Security number at the trial, they do have my Social Security number. I don't really know where you're going with that question, but if you want to follow up, maybe.
I'm saying if you have a social security number, you're basically a United Nations subject.
Well,
I can get with you on that.
okay, yeah. I wondered if that was the question, because I've had people before who said, well, if you have a Social Security number, you're subject to the American government too, and in that way they can draft you. I never applied for a Social Security card, and that was something my parents did. So maybe they can go back and draft my parents. But no, seriously, I think there's a body of thought that says, well, if you've ever had anything to do with the government, that somehow it's all right for them to take away some of your freedoms. And I don't accept that. I think now they're talking about voluntary national service, where maybe you would have to serve 2 years to get a driver's license. Well, that's the kind of voluntary that stretches the term. What they're really saying is you are free unless you want to cross the street. Because, I mean, people are born into the society. If they want to cross the street, the government's going to say, well, you stepped on public ground, so now we have the right to do all these things that the Bill of Rights says they don't have the right to. And I really just don't accept that analysis. Even if someone has applied for Social Security or done whatever, usually through the fact that government is in some way coercing them to do these things, it doesn't justify further coercion. I don't know if that's exactly what you were getting to, but...
Two very, very quick points. One, there is one further argument against the draft, and it's especially good if you're talking to someone who's in the service or about to go in. Just mention that in case of combat, you want to make sure that the people on his flanks are there because they want to be. The other is that although when you register for the draft, you have to hand in your form with ID to the man at the post office. Many post offices have change of address forms for selective service where you just fill it out and mail it in. And whereas I would never do something as criminal as filling out a false one and sending it in just to complicate matters, I'm sure there are some uncivic people who would fill out one or more and try to see how much they could foul things up. I would never recommend it, but I know there's some people like that out there.
Thank you, Paul and Jeff, for joining us today on this panel. I'm sure both Paul and Jeff will be around at the conference for the remainder of the day at least, and if you have any additional questions and want to buttonhole them out in the hall or later on in some of the activities, I'm sure they would entertain questions. Thanks again.